Every morning before the village of Hollowmere had fully opened its eyes, a man named Silas Thorne let himself through a garden gate that was not his to open. He was 62 years old, and for 20 of those years he had knelt in the frost-hardened soil of a walled garden behind a house that no one had lived in since before most of the village's children were born. He never spoke of why he came. He never explained, not to the postmistress who watched him pass her window each dawn, not to the innkeeper who sometimes left a warm roll upon his doorstep, and not even to himself during the long, peaceful hours he spent among the roses. He simply came every morning, through rain, frost, or the season's first soft snowfall, and tended flowers that belonged, by every right of law and reason, to a woman named Clara Wynne, who had left Hollowmere 2 decades earlier and never once returned. The air at that hour still carried the hush of true night, a stillness broken only by the occasional call of a rook settling into the bare branches of the churchyard elms, or the distant, muffled clatter of a milk cart making its slow way along some far cobbled street. The cold had a particular smell to it in those first weeks of true frost, clean and faintly metallic, mixed with the deeper, earthier scent of turned soil and fallen leaves left to soften beneath the hedgerows, and Silas had long since come to think of that particular blend of scents as the true smell of Hollowmere itself, more than wood smoke or bread or any of the warmer fragrances the day would later bring. Behind him, Hollowmere Hall stood dark and shuttered beneath the pale morning sky, its windows like closed eyes that had long since forgotten the people who once laughed behind them. Ivy had climbed patiently across the old stone walls in slow, quiet patterns. The pathways had softened beneath moss, and yet the garden itself, the small walled square of earth that Clara Wynne had cherished more than any room in that grand house, remained wonderfully, almost impossibly alive. Villagers walking to market often slowed as they passed the low garden wall, catching glimpses of neat flower beds and carefully pruned roses beyond the weathered stones. Some smiled quietly, others wondered, yet very few ever asked Silas what he was doing there, or why a man would devote 20 years of gentle mornings to a garden that had never truly been his. On market mornings especially, when carts rattled past laden with early cabbages and folded bolts of wool cloth, the low garden wall drew more glances than usual, farmers pausing their horses for the length of a breath to admire a particular stand of late chrysanthemums or the neat, disciplined rows of herbs along the southern border, before the press of the day's business carried them onward toward the green. On this particular morning, a fine silver frost rested upon the grass, while the first light of dawn touched only the highest branches of the ancient oaks. Silas knelt beside a rosebush near the garden's far wall. It was the oldest rose in the garden, and perhaps the most determined. Though every other plant nearby had surrendered to the season, this one carried a single white blossom, perfectly open and entirely untroubled by the cold. Silas reached out and brushed one delicate petal with the careful tenderness of a man greeting an old friend. He had welcomed that same quiet miracle every autumn for 20 years. He could still remember, faintly, the particular chill of the very first such morning, decades before, when he had barely dared believe the bush would survive its first hard winter at all, and the quiet, private wonder he had felt each year since, watching it prove him wrong again and again. And somewhere within the steady rhythm of those mornings, the garden had gently gathered a story that seemed content to bloom in silence, waiting patiently for those willing to listen. By the time the sun had fully cleared the oaks, Hollowmere was beginning to stir in its usual unhurried way. Smoke rose in thin gray ribbons from cottage chimneys along Elderbrook Lane, where Silas had lived alone since he was a young man, in a small stone house with a blue door and a garden of his own that he tended with far less ceremony than the one behind the hall. He kept chickens and a modest row of vegetables, and a kettle that seemed to know his habits better than he did. warming itself each morning at precisely the hour he came through his door. His neighbors along the lane had grown so used to the sight of him passing before breakfast, secateurs tucked into his coat pocket, that they no longer thought to remark on it. It was simply part of the shape of a Hollowmere morning, as familiar as the bakery opening its shutters or the church bell marking the half-hour. In summer, the lane smelled of warm dust and the honeysuckle that climbed wild along the Atwood's fence, and in winter it smelled of wood smoke and the cold, mineral tang of frost on stone. But in every season it carried the same unhurried rhythm, doors opening and closing at their accustomed hours, kettles set to boil, the soft creak of garden gates swinging on hinges that had not been oiled in years and did not, by any account, need to be. The village itself unfolded in the same gentle patterns it always had. On Hollowmere Green, an old dog dozed in a patch of early sun outside the bookseller's shop, undisturbed by the creak of the door as the first customer of the day let himself in. Down toward the bridge, the baker's wife set out trays of bread still warm enough to fog the cold glass of her window, and the smell of it drifted along the cobblestones, mixing with wood smoke and the damp green smell of the river. Farther along, where the lane bent toward the mill pond, the water moved slow and dark beneath a thin morning mist, and the old stone bridge, worn smooth by generations of passing feet, held the particular hush that bridges seem always to hold at that early hour, before the day's first travelers began to cross it. It was the kind of village where a person could live an entire life and be known, gently and completely, by everyone in it, and yet Silas Thorne, who had lived there longer than most, remained in some quiet way a mystery even to his oldest neighbors. Mrs. Atwood, who had run the village post office for as long as anyone could remember and who considered herself, not without reason, the keeper of most of Hollowmere's small truths, was one of the few who dared to ask after him at all. She did so gently, and always in passing, the way one might inquire after the weather. She would see him crossing the green with his tools in hand and call out some small kindness, often from behind the small counter of the post office itself, where parcels and letters sat sorted in neat wooden pigeonholes along the wall, the whole shop smelling faintly of sealing wax and old paper, and asking whether the frost had been unkind to the roses, or whether he meant to stay for tea before the cold set in properly. He would answer her with the same soft, unhurried courtesy he offered everyone, and yet he never once, in all the years she had known him, told her why he still tended a garden that belonged to no one who remained in the village to thank him for it. It was not that Hollowmere lacked curiosity. It was, if anything, a village built on the gentle passing of small stories from doorstep to doorstep. But there was something about Silas's quiet devotion to that walled garden that seemed to ask, without words, to be left alone. And so, out of a kind of collective tenderness that villages sometimes show toward the things they do not fully understand, Hollowmere let him keep his silence, and contented itself with watching the roses bloom year after year, as though that alone were answer enough. Before we wander any further into Hollowmere this evening, if you're settling in for the night, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let us return to Silas, and to the garden that had waited 20 years to tell its story. Silas had not always been the quiet, weathered man who knelt each morning in another woman's garden. There had been a time, more than 40 years past, when he was young and new to Hollowmere, and had come to Hollowmere Hall with little more than a pair of worn gloves and a letter of recommendation from a gardener 2 villages over who had taught him everything he knew about roses and very little about anything else. He had been hired as an under-gardener, the lowest and least noticed of the household staff, tasked with the unglamorous work of turning soil and mending fences and hauling water to beds that grander men considered beneath their notice. He had not expected, in those first months, that the garden would come to hold more of his heart than any other place he had ever lived. It was Clara Wynne who changed that, though she never seemed to know it, not truly, not until many years later than either of them might have wished. She was the daughter of the house, young herself in those early days, with a habit of walking the garden paths each evening just as the light was beginning to soften. Her hands often full of cuttings she meant to press into her mother's old books, her attention caught by whichever bloom had opened since morning. She was not the sort of mistress who kept her distance from the men who tended her family's grounds. She asked Silas questions about the roses that no one else in the household thought to ask, questions about which varieties preferred shade and which needed the fullest sun, and she listened to his answers with an attentiveness that made him feel, for the first time in his young life, that his work was something more than labor. Over the seasons that followed, a quiet friendship grew between them, the kind that neither of them ever named aloud, perhaps because naming it would have required acknowledging what it was becoming. Clara would bring him tea in the potting shed on cold afternoons, setting the cup down without ceremony beside whatever he was working on, and stay to talk of small things, the weather, the state of the roses, a book she was reading, while he worked and listened and said little, content simply to be near her. The shed itself was small and close, smelling always of turned earth and drying herbs bundled along the rafters. A single narrow window letting in whatever thin light the season allowed, and it became, over those quiet years, the one place in the whole of Hollowmere Hall where Silas felt entirely at ease. It was Clara who chose the site for the white rosebush near the garden's far wall, planting it herself one spring afternoon with Silas kneeling beside her to steady the roots, and it was Clara who named it, half in jest, after her own mother, saying that the bush, like the woman it was named for, would no doubt outlive them all through sheer stubbornness. They had chosen the spot carefully, the two of them, testing the light at different hours of the afternoon before settling on that particular corner near the far wall, where the old stone still held a little warmth even into the evening, and Clara had insisted, laughing, that a rose given such a favored position owed them nothing less than a lifetime of stubborn, faithful blooming. The years passed gently in this way, seasons folding into one another, the garden growing more beautiful with each turn of Silas's careful hands, the roses climbing higher along the old trellises each summer, the beds along the southern wall filling in with lavender and foxglove that Clara herself had chosen for their color against the gray stone, the whole garden slowly becoming, season by patient season, less a collection of plantings and more a single living thing that breathed and changed. With the turning of the year, and though neither of them ever spoke the word that might have described what had grown between them alongside the roses, there were moments, quiet and unremarkable to anyone watching, that Silas would carry with him for the rest of his life. The way Clara laughed when a startled thrush burst suddenly from the hedge. The particular stillness that settled over her when she stood before the white rose in early autumn, as though the bloom meant something to her that she had never fully explained. The evening, not long before everything changed, when she pressed a small iron key into his palm without a word of explanation, only asking him, gently, to keep the garden growing no matter what came. He had not understood then what she meant by those words, nor why her eyes had held something close to sorrow as she said them. The afternoon itself had been an ordinary one otherwise, the light beginning its early autumn slant across the beds, a robin working the turned soil near their feet for whatever grubs the season's last digging had uncovered, and it was only much later, turning the memory over and over through the long years that followed, that Silas came to understand how much that particular ordinary afternoon had actually been holding. Hollowmere in those years was, as it remains now, a village slow to change and slower still to speak of hard things, and whatever trouble had begun to gather around Clara Wynne and her family in that final season, it moved through the household like weather behind drawn curtains, felt more than seen. There was talk, faint and never quite confirmed, of a summons that had come from far away, of a family obligation that could not be refused, of a departure arranged with a haste that left little room for proper goodbyes. Silas, being neither family nor equal in the strict accounting of the household, was told nothing directly. He learned only that Clara was leaving, and that she meant, by all appearances, to return. The morning of her departure remained, even after 20 years, the clearest morning of his life. He remembered the carriage waiting at the front of the hall, the trunks already loaded, the household staff gathered in a loose, uncertain half-circle near the entrance, their breath visible in the cold morning air, a few of the younger maids exchanging uncertain glances they were careful not to let the family see, none of them quite certain how long the mistress's daughter intended to be away. He remembered Clara pausing at the garden gate, out of sight of the others, to press that same small iron key more firmly into his hand, her fingers cold in the early chill, and to ask him once more, in a voice he had never heard her use before, to keep the garden growing whatever happened, however long it took. He had promised her, simply and without hesitation, because it had never once occurred to him to refuse her anything. And then she was gone, the carriage rolling away down the long drive and out through the village, the wheels loud on the gravel before fading into the softer hush of the lane beyond the gates. A single gloved hand raised briefly from the carriage window and then withdrawn, and Silas Thorne had stood at the garden gate with the key warm now in his closed fist, not yet understanding that he would spend the next 20 years keeping that single, quiet promise. In the weeks that followed, the household had waited for word of her return, as had the village in its own gentle way. But the weeks became months, and the months folded slowly into years, and no word ever came that offered any real explanation. Only fragments passed hand to hand through Hollowmere's patient grapevine, each one thinner and less certain than the last. The family closed the hall not long after, the older Wynns following their daughter away from the village for reasons no one in Hollowmere ever fully learned. And the great house had stood empty ever since, its windows dark, its hall silent, its garden left, by every reasonable expectation, to return slowly to wilderness. Only it never did. Silas continued coming each morning, at first perhaps out of simple habit, the way a man continues walking a familiar path even after the reason for walking it has grown uncertain. And then, as the seasons multiplied, out of something that had settled far more deeply into him than habit alone. He told himself, in those early years, that he was merely honoring a promise, a small and private duty owed to a friend who might yet return to find her garden waiting exactly as she had left it. But as 1 year became 5, and 5 became 10, and 10 became 20, the tending of that garden had become something else entirely, something Silas himself had never fully examined, though anyone who watched him kneel each morning beside the white rose might have recognized it easily enough for what it was. Mrs. Atwood certainly suspected, though she had never once said so aloud, not even to him. She remembered Clara Wynne well, remembered the particular way the young woman had smiled whenever she passed the post-office window, remembered too, though more faintly, the rumors that had once moved through the village in the weeks after her sudden departure. She had watched Silas grow older across the passing seasons, watched the small stoop that had settled into his shoulders, the gray that had crept slowly into his hair, and she had come, over the years, to understand that his devotion to that garden was not merely the keeping of a promise made to a friend, but something quieter and far more tender, a love that had never been given the chance to become anything else, and so had simply continued, faithfully, in the only form left available to it, blooming each year in a garden that waited, as he did, for a return that had never yet come. It was on a mild afternoon in early autumn, not unlike the one in which this story began, that a stranger came walking up the long, weed-softened drive of Hollowmere Hall for the first time in 20 years. He was a young man, perhaps in his middle 30s, dressed in the manner of someone unaccustomed to country roads, his shoes already dusted with the pale earth of the drive, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder as though he had come some distance and did not entirely trust himself to leave it behind. The drive itself, long neglected, had gone soft with moss between its old paving stones, and weeds grew tall along its edges where gardeners had once kept everything trimmed close, so that his footsteps fell almost silently, the only real sound the distant call of a wood pigeon somewhere among the hall's overgrown yews. He paused often as he walked, looking up at the darkened windows of the hall with the particular caution of someone approaching a place he had only ever heard described, never seen. Silas noticed him before the young man noticed the garden at all. He was kneeling, as he always was at that hour, among the roses near the far wall, and he straightened slowly at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps on the gravel path beyond the gate. Footsteps that did not belong to any of the handful of villagers who occasionally wandered near the hall out of idle curiosity. The stranger stopped at the low garden wall, much as the market-day passers-by so often did, and stood for a long moment simply looking at the flower beds beyond it, an expression on his face that Silas recognized at once, though he could not yet have said why, as something close to recognition rather than mere surprise. The late afternoon light fell warm and slanting across the beds just then, catching the last of the season's dahlias in deep bronze and gold, and for a moment the young man simply stood there silent, as though the sight of so much careful color behind such a neglected house had caught him entirely off guard. The young man introduced himself, once he found his voice, as Tom Wynne, and watched carefully for some reaction to the name, though Silas gave away nothing of what the words had stirred in him. Tom explained, a little uncertainly, that he was Clara Wynne's nephew, the son of her younger brother, and that he had come to Hollowmere for the first time in his life to see the family home he had heard spoken of only in fragments over the years, half-remembered stories told at holiday tables by relatives who themselves had never fully understood why the hall had been abandoned so completely, or why his aunt had so rarely spoken of the village where she had spent her girlhood. Silas listened to all of this with the same quiet, unhurried attention he had once given Clara herself, though something in his chest had gone very still and very careful, as though he were handling a thing that might shatter if held too tightly. He asked, when Tom finally paused, whether Clara was well, and the question came out steadier than he felt asking it. Tom's face changed then, in the particular way faces change when they must deliver news they have not yet grown used to carrying themselves, and he explained, gently and a little apologetically, that his aunt had passed away some months earlier, quite peacefully, in the small coastal town where she had spent the last many years of her life, far from Hollowmere and from any of the people who had once known her here. The garden seemed very quiet after that, quieter than Silas had ever known it to be, even in the deepest hush of winter. He said nothing for a long moment, only reached out, almost without thinking, to steady himself against the low stone wall, the stone cool and rough beneath his palm, solid in a way that little else in that moment seemed to be, and Tom, sensing perhaps more than he understood, did not press him to speak. When Silas finally found words again, they were simple ones, an offer of tea, an invitation to sit for a while in the shade of the old oak near the gate, and Tom accepted with visible relief, as though he too had been carrying something heavier than he had expected this quiet errand to become. They sat together for a long while as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the garden, a pot of tea gone lukewarm between them on the low wall, the shadows of the old oak lengthening gradually across the beds as the hour advanced, and in the gentle, meandering way that grief sometimes allows strangers to speak more freely than old friends, Tom told Silas what little he knew of his aunt's later years. She had never married, though she had lived, by every account, a full and quietly contented life, keeping a small cottage garden of her own that neighbors in her coastal town had apparently admired for its roses above all else. She had spoken rarely of Hollowmere, and never in detail, though Tom recalled, with the particular clarity that certain childhood memories carry, the way she would sometimes grow distant and soft-eyed each autumn, watching for something in the garden that never quite seemed to arrive. He recalled, too, that his aunt had kept, in her later years, a small framed pressing of a white rose on her writing desk, faded almost to gray with age, though he had never once, in all his visits, thought to ask her where it had come from. It was only near the end of their conversation, as the light had begun to lengthen into the gold of late afternoon, that Tom mentioned the letter. He explained, a little hesitantly, that in sorting through his aunt's belongings after her passing, the family had come across a small wooden box tucked away in the back of a wardrobe, containing pressed flowers, a handful of old photographs, and a single sealed envelope addressed simply to Silas, care of Hollowmere Hall, in handwriting that had clearly been written many years before, though the envelope itself showed no sign of ever having been sent. Tom had brought it with him, he explained, more out of a nephew's dutiful instinct than any real understanding of what it might contain, uncertain even whether the man it was addressed to still lived, or still remained in the village his aunt had left so long ago. Silas took the letter from him with hands that were, for the first time in longer than he could remember, not entirely steady. It was lighter than he had expected, the paper gone soft and slightly yellowed with age. His own name written across the front in a hand he would have known anywhere, in any light, after any number of years. He did not open it there in the garden, with Tom watching, however kindly. He only held it, turning it once in his fingers as though testing whether it were truly real, the paper cool and slightly rough beneath his fingertips, carrying faintly the particular dry smell that old-kept paper always seems to gather, and then tucked it carefully into the breast pocket of his coat, close against his chest, where he could feel its small weight through the fabric for the rest of that long afternoon, the sun by then beginning its slow slide toward the tops of the western hedgerows, gilding the edges of the garden beds in a soft, unhurried gold that seemed, that particular afternoon, almost too gentle for what had just passed between them. Tom stayed only a short while longer, speaking of his plan to look into the state of the hall, to see whether it might be worth restoring, though he admitted he had not yet decided what, if anything, he meant to do with a house he had never known and a village to which he felt only the thinnest, most inherited connection. Before he left, he asked Silas, with a gentleness that suggested he understood, even without being told, that he had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple errand of family business, whether the roses had always grown so well in a garden no one tended. Silas answered only that he supposed some things kept growing whether or not anyone remembered to ask why, and Tom seemed to accept this, nodding slowly, before making his way back down the long drive and out of the village as quietly as he had come. That evening Silas did not open the letter. He carried it home along Elderbrook Lane as the sky deepened into dusk, past the bakery closing its shutters and the lamplighter beginning his rounds along the green. The whole village bathed in that particular soft blue light that comes only in the last quarter hour before true dark, when every shape along the lane grows gentle and indistinct, and he set it, still sealed, on the small table beside his kitchen window, where it remained through the whole of a long and mostly sleepless night. He told himself, in the quiet hours when sleep would not come, that he was not yet ready, though he could not have said precisely what he feared finding inside those few folded pages, after 20 years of not knowing. Perhaps it was simply that a promise kept in silence had come, in some strange way, to feel safer than the truth it had been keeping him from. Mrs. Atwood noticed the change in him almost immediately, the following morning, when he passed her window at his usual hour but did not pause, as he sometimes did, to exchange even the smallest word of greeting. She watched him go, his shoulders drawn in against a cold that seemed, that particular morning, to have very little to do with the weather, and though she said nothing to him then, she found herself thinking, for the first time in many years, of Clara Wynn's quiet departure, and of the questions Hollowmere had long ago learned not to ask aloud. For 3 days, the letter remained unopened on the small table beside Silas's kitchen window, and for 3 days, Hollowmere continued around him in its usual unhurried rhythm, entirely unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place behind the blue door on Elderbrook Lane. He rose each morning at his customary hour, made his way to the garden as he always had, tended the roses with the same careful attention he had given them for 20 years, and returned each evening to sit beside that small folded weight of paper without ever quite finding the courage to break its seal. It was not, he told himself, that he feared bad news, for what worse news could there be than the news he had already received? It was something harder to name, a fear that the letter might undo the careful, patient shape he had built his life around, that whatever Clara had written might ask something of him he no longer knew how to give, or worse, might offer an explanation so simple and so ordinary that it would make the 20 years of waiting feel, in some quiet way, foolish. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Atwood found him sitting on the low wall outside the post office rather than continuing on toward the hall as he always did, and though she had learned, over many years of gentle friendship, not to press him when he was not ready to speak, something in the stillness of his posture that morning moved her to sit down beside him anyway, without being asked. They sat together for a long while in comfortable silence, watching the village wake around them, the baker's boy delivering his early loaves, the dog outside the bookseller's stretching itself awake in a fresh patch of sun, a thin curl of smoke rising from the bakery's chimney, the first cart of the day rattling slow across the old stone bridge, and it was only when the church bell struck the half-hour that Silas finally spoke, telling her, in a voice gone rough with disuse, of the letter waiting on his kitchen table, and of the 20 years that had led to it. Mrs. Atwood listened without interrupting, her hands folded quietly in her lap, and when he had finished, she did not offer him advice, nor did she tell him what she suspected the letter might contain, though her own memory of Clara Wynn's departure had grown clearer with every hour since Tom's visit had passed through the village grapevine, as such things inevitably did. She said only that some doors, once opened, could never again be closed, but that a door left forever shut was its own kind of prison, quieter perhaps, but no less confining, and that she had watched him carry his particular door for longer than any man ought to carry anything alone. Silas said nothing in reply, but something in her words settled into him differently than anything else had in the days since Tom's visit, and he found himself, for the first time, truly considering what it might mean to finally read what Clara had left for him. That evening, as the light softened over Hollowmere and the first chill of true autumn crept into the air, Silas found himself walking, without quite deciding to, back toward the hall rather than toward his own quiet cottage. He let himself through the garden gate as the sky deepened into violet, the letter still tucked unopened in his breast pocket, and knelt beside the white rosebush in the last of the day's fading light, as though the garden itself, and not his own kitchen table, were the only place he could imagine finally breaking that long-kept silence. The evening had turned unusually still, the kind of hush that settles over a garden just before the first true frost of the season, every leaf and blade of grass holding its shape without the smallest stir of wind, and somewhere beyond the wall a blackbird sang its last unhurried notes of the day before falling silent. He did not open the letter that evening either, though he came closer than he had in 3 days, his fingers resting against the worn edge of the envelope for a long, suspended moment before he drew his hand away again, unwilling still to let the last small comfort of not knowing slip finally out of his grasp. It was in those quiet, unresolved evenings that fragments of the past began returning to him more vividly than they had in years, unbidden and unhurried, the way memory often surfaces when a heart has finally allowed itself to sit still long enough to remember properly. He found himself thinking often of the final weeks before Clara's departure, weeks he had, for 2 decades, allowed himself to recall only in careful, guarded pieces, as though examining them too closely might cause the whole fragile memory to come apart. He remembered now, with a clarity that surprised him, the particular quietness that had settled over Clara in those last weeks, a stillness he had mistaken, at the time, for simple autumn melancholy, though he understood now, with the slow wisdom of hindsight, that it had been something far heavier than the changing of a season. He remembered an afternoon, not long before the carriage came, when he had found her sitting alone on the low garden wall, her hands folded in her lap in a way that seemed, even then, unlike her usual restless energy among the flower beds. She had not heard him approach, and when she finally looked up, there had been something in her eyes he had never seen there before, a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour or the season, and everything, he understood now, to do with whatever burden had begun quietly gathering around her family in those final weeks. She had smiled at him then, the way she always did, but it had been a smaller smile than usual, careful in a way that suggested she was holding something back, some difficulty she did not yet feel able to share, even with him. He remembered, too, with a tenderness that had only deepened with the passing years rather than faded, the evening she had chosen the site for the white rosebush, kneeling together with him in the softening light while she spoke, half to herself, of wanting to plant something that would outlast whatever troubles came, something that would still be blooming long after the difficulties of any particular season had passed. He had not understood, at the time, that she was speaking of anything beyond the ordinary uncertainties of gardening, the risk that any young plant might fail to take root, might not survive its first hard winter. Only now, sitting once more beside that same rosebush 20 years later with her unopened letter warm against his chest, did he begin to wonder whether she had already known, even then, that some larger uncertainty was gathering around her, some difficulty she could not yet name aloud, not even to him. The days continued to pass in this quiet, unresolved way, each one bringing Silas a little closer to the letter and yet no closer to actually opening it, until Tom Wynne returned to the village once more, a little over a week after his first visit, this time with the stated intention of beginning the practical work of assessing what might be done with the long-neglected hall. He found Silas in the garden as before, and though their conversation began with the ordinary business of surveyors and roof repairs and the slow, careful work of restoring a house left empty for 20 years, it drifted, as it inevitably would, toward gentler questions, toward Tom's growing curiosity about the relationship between his aunt and the quiet gardener who had kept her roses alive for 2 decades without any promise of thanks or return. Tom had spent that particular morning walking through the hall's empty rooms for the first time with any real attention, and he described them to Silas now with the wonder of someone discovering a house rather than inheriting one. The long gallery with its faded portraits still hanging exactly where they had always hung, the drawing room with its furniture shrouded under 2 decades of dust sheets, the nursery upstairs, and used even in his aunt's own girlhood, its small window looking out, he had noticed directly over the walled garden below. It was Tom, in fact, who finally asked the question that Mrs. Atwood had been too gentle, or perhaps too wise, ever to ask directly. He inquired, carefully and without any intention of causing pain, whether Silas had yet found the courage to read what his aunt had left for him, and Silas, surprising himself as much as he surprised Tom, found that he was finally ready to answer honestly. He admitted that he had not, that the letter remained sealed, carried each day in his breast pocket like a small unlit lamp he was not yet ready to kindle, and Tom, with the particular wisdom that grief sometimes grants even to those who did not know the person being grieved, said only that his aunt had kept that letter for the whole remainder of her life without ever finding a way to send it, and that perhaps, whatever courage she had lacked in the sending of it, the least Silas could offer in return was the courage to finally receive it. Before Silas made his way home that evening, He found himself lingering a while longer in the garden with Mrs. Atwood, who had come by unannounced, as she sometimes did in the softer hours before dusk, carrying a small basket she claimed was meant for no particular purpose beyond an excuse to sit a while among the roses. She settled herself on the low stone wall near the gate, watching Silas move slowly between the beds in the fading light, and it was some time before either of them spoke, the silence between them the comfortable sort that only grows between people who have known each other the better part of a lifetime. It was Mrs. Atwood who finally broke it, speaking not of the letter directly, for she had learned long ago not to press him where that was concerned, but of something older, a memory she said had come back to her unexpectedly that very afternoon while sorting old parish records for the vicar, records that happened to touch the years surrounding Clara Wynn's departure. She told him, carefully and without embellishment, that she had come across a brief mention, in an old ledger of the village's small charitable fund, of a discreet payment made to a physician in a coastal town some distance from Hollowmere, made in the same season Clara had left, arranged, the ledger noted, at the quiet request of the elder Mr. Wynne. Silas straightened slowly at this, his hands still full of the shears he had been using, and said nothing for a long moment, only turned the small detail over carefully in his mind, the way he might turn over an unfamiliar seed before deciding whether it belonged in any bed he tended. Mrs. Atwood watched him with the same gentle patience she always showed him, and said only that she had thought, reading the entry, that it might mean something to him, though she confessed she did not know precisely what, only that it seemed to confirm what the village had always half suspected without ever quite being able to say aloud, that whatever had taken the Wynnes away from Hollowmere so suddenly had been a matter of illness rather than scandal, of care rather than shame. He asked her, after a while, whether she remembered anything more of that season, any small detail that might have passed unnoticed at the time but seemed, now, worth remembering properly. She thought for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the darkening line of the garden wall, and told him that she recalled, though only faintly, the particular quiet that had settled over the hall in the weeks before the family's departure. A hush she had noticed even from her post-office window, fewer visitors coming and going along the drive, fewer lamps lit of an evening than usual, as though the household itself had been holding its breath against some difficulty it did not yet wish the village to see. She remembered too, she said, a conversation she had once had with the housekeeper, long since passed on herself, who had let slip, in a moment of tired candor, that the elder Mr. Wynne had taken to keeping to his rooms more and more in those final weeks, and that Clara herself had grown thin and watchful in a way that worried the household staff, though none of them had dared ask directly what troubled her, for it was not, in those days, a household given to open discussion of such private matters. Mrs. Atwood said she had thought little of it at the time, one small rumor among the dozens that moved through a village like Hollowmere in any given season, but that she understood now, looking back with the fuller knowledge the intervening years had brought her, that she had been witnessing, without knowing it, the quiet unraveling of a family doing its best to protect a father's dignity even as it upended a daughter's entire life. Silas listened to all of this with the same careful attention he gave everything Mrs. Atwood told him, and when she had finished, he found himself thinking not of anger, though he supposed some men in his position might have felt it, at having been kept so entirely in the dark for so long, but of a kind of quiet tenderness for the young woman Clara must have been in those difficult weeks, carrying a burden she could not share, honoring a father's wish for privacy even as it cost her. He now understood far more than anyone around her had ever realized. He said as much to Mrs. Atwood, and she nodded slowly, saying only that it was often the case, in her long experience of village life, that the people who seemed most in need of explanation were usually carrying reasons far kinder than anyone imagined, reasons that silence alone made to look, unfairly, like coldness or neglect. They sat together a while longer as the last light drained slowly from the sky, And before she left him, Mrs. Atwood asked, gently and without any real expectation of an answer, whether this small new piece of the past made him any more ready to read what Clara herself had finally written. Silas considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over every question she asked him, and admitted that he thought perhaps it did, that knowing even this small fragment of the truth, the illness, the discretion, the quiet family sacrifice that had shaped those final weeks, made the prospect of the letter feel less like an unknown reckoning and more like the last missing piece of a story he had already, in some sense, begun to understand. Mrs. Atwood smiled at this, the particular warm, unhurried smile she reserved for the moments when she felt Hollowmere's slow patience had finally been rewarded, and told him only that she thought Clara would be glad, wherever she was, that the truth had finally found its way to him, in whatever quiet fashion the years had chosen to deliver it. She left him not long after, making her way back across the green as the lamplighter began his evening rounds, and Silas remained a while longer in the garden alone, kneeling once more beside the white rosebush as the last color faded from the sky. An owl called once, somewhere beyond the orchard, and was answered, after a long pause, by another farther off, the two calls passing back and forth across the darkening fields like some old, patient conversation. He found himself thinking, in the deepening quiet, of the elder Mr. Wynne, a man he had known only distantly in his years of service at the Hall, and of the particular kind of love that asks a family to uproot an entire life rather than let its head be seen in decline. And he understood, kneeling there, that Clara's silence at the garden gate all those years ago had never truly been about him at all, but about a daughter's quiet loyalty to a father who had asked, in his final difficult season, for nothing more than the dignity of privacy. It was with this new, gentler understanding settled quietly into him that Silas finally rose from beside the rosebush and made his way toward the garden gate, the small iron key cool in his hand as he locked it behind him, the letter still resting unopened in his breast pocket, though it felt, for the first time since Tom had placed it in his hands, less like an unanswered question and more like the last quiet page of a story he had already, in his heart, begun to forgive. A last blackbird called somewhere near the orchard wall as he crossed the green toward home, its song thin and unhurried against the gathering dusk, and Silas found himself pausing to listen a moment longer than he might once have, as though even that small ordinary sound had something worth attending to on an evening such as this one. That night, walking home along Elderbrook Lane beneath a sky just beginning to soften into early stars, Silas found himself thinking not of fear, for the first time in many days, but of Clara herself, of the particular warmth of her laughter when a startled thrush burst from the garden hedge, of the quiet, steady companionship of all those cold afternoons in the potting shed, of the small iron key she had pressed into his hand with a request he had spent 20 faithful years honoring without ever fully understanding why. He thought of the white rose blooming impossibly every autumn since her departure, as though the garden itself had been keeping some promise of its own alongside his, and he understood, with a gentleness that felt almost like relief, that whatever the letter contained, it could not undo the 20 years of quiet devotion that had already, in their own patient way, become the truest answer to the question he had never dared ask aloud. He reached his cottage a little before 9, the kettle already cooling on its stand, the small table by the kitchen window bathed in the soft gold of a single lit lamp, and for a long moment he simply stood in his own doorway, looking at the letter waiting there exactly as it had waited for 3 days, as though it too understood that its moment had finally, quietly arrived. He crossed the room slowly, drew out the chair he had sat in every evening that week without ever finding the courage to use it for this purpose, and settled himself at the table with the same careful, unhurried attention he brought to every rose he had ever tended. And there, in the gentle hush of his small kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the whole quiet village settling into sleep around him, Silas Thorne finally reached for the letter, his own heartbeat unusually loud in his ears in that particular stillness, and, after 20 years of faithful waiting, began at last to break its seal. The letter, when at last it lay open beneath the lamp's soft light, proved to be several pages long, the handwriting close and careful in places, hurried and uneven in others, as though it had been written across more than one sitting, perhaps even across more than 1 year. Outside, the lane had gone fully quiet, the last lit window along Elderbrook Lane dimming somewhere behind him, and only the small circle of lamplight at his own table remained, warm and steady, holding back the wider dark the way it had held back 1,000 ordinary evenings before this one. Silas smoothed the pages flat with hands that had gone strangely steady now that the moment of opening had finally passed, and he began to read slowly, the way a man reads something he has waited a very long time to understand, unwilling to let a single word slip by unnoticed. Clara had begun the letter, he found, only a few short weeks after her departure from Hollowmere, in a small rented room in a town whose name meant nothing to him, though he understood now that it must have been the coastal town Tom had spoken of, the place where she had gone to spend the rest of her life among strangers rather than the village that had once known her so completely. She wrote first of the ordinary details of her new circumstances, the unfamiliar sound of gulls rather than thrushes, the particular gray light of a coastline so unlike the green hush of Hollowmere, the way the fog rolled in most mornings off the water before burning away by midday, the constant low murmur of waves against a shingle beach that never quite settled into the silence she had known all her life inland. And Silas understood, reading these early lines, that she had needed, before anything else, simply to speak to him as she once had, across whatever distance now separated them, even knowing the words might never actually reach him. It was only a few pages further that she began, gently and with evident difficulty, to explain what had truly happened in those final weeks before her departure, the weeks whose quiet heaviness Silas had sensed but never understood. Her father, she wrote, had fallen seriously ill that autumn, a decline the family had kept carefully hidden even from most of their own household, fearing what open knowledge of it might mean for a man who had always guarded his dignity above almost everything else. The physicians who had been consulted, men summoned discreetly from the city and lodged for a night or two at the inn under names the innkeeper had never thought to question, had recommended a particular climate and a particular kind of specialized care, available only in the coastal region where the family had once, briefly, summered when Clara was a girl, and the decision had been made, swiftly and without much room for discussion, that the family would relocate there entirely, for as long as it took, however long that might prove to be. Clara had known, she wrote, in the days before she left, that she could not explain the full truth of her father's illness to anyone in the village, not out of any wish to deceive, but because her father himself had asked, with what dignity remained to him, that the matter be kept as private as possible for as long as possible. She had honored that wish even in her final hurried goodbye to Silas at the garden gate, though she confessed, in the letter's careful handwriting, that leaving him with so little explanation had been among the hardest things she had ever done, harder even than the uncertainty of what lay ahead for her father, because she had believed, in that moment, that she was leaving only for a season, that she would return to Hollowmere and to her garden and to the quiet, steady comfort of Silas's company, within a matter of months at most. The months, she wrote, had become a year, and then, too, her father's decline slower and more complicated than the physicians had first suggested, requiring a kind of constant, careful attention that made any thought of leaving him, even briefly, unthinkable. She had written, in those early years, several letters intended for Silas, drafts she kept in the same small wooden box Tom had eventually found, though she had never found the courage or perhaps the right words to actually send any of them, fearing always that whatever she wrote would sound, from such a distance and after such a silence, either too much or not nearly enough. By the time her father finally passed, some 3 years after their departure from Hollowmere, she confessed that she had lost, somewhere in that long, exhausting stretch of grief and caretaking, whatever certainty she had once carried about her own eventual return. There followed, in the letter, a passage that Silas read more slowly than any other, his eyes moving back over the lines more than once before he could fully absorb their meaning. Clara wrote that in the years following her father's death, she had told herself again and again that she would return to Hollowmere, that she would walk once more through the garden gate and find Silas exactly where she had left him, and that whatever explanation she owed him could finally be given properly, in person, rather than through the inadequate medium of ink and paper. But each year that passed made the prospect feel simultaneously more urgent and more impossible. For how, she wondered, could she return after so long a silence and expect to find anything unchanged? And worse, what right did she have to disrupt whatever peace he might have found in her absence, whatever life he might have quietly built without her? It was easier, she admitted, with an honesty that seemed to cost her something even in the writing of it, to remain at a safe distance, tending her own small garden in that unfamiliar coastal town, allowing herself the private, guarded comfort of imagining Hollowmere exactly as she had left it, rather than risk discovering that time had moved on entirely without her, that the garden had gone to ruin or worse, that Silas himself had long since stopped thinking of her at all. She wrote of planting roses of her own in that new garden, roses that never quite matched, in her own private estimation, the particular beauty of the ones she had left behind, and she confessed that every autumn, without fail, in that particular quality of light one found only there, thin and silver over the water, never quite managing to remind her of home and yet never entirely failing to either, she found herself thinking of the white rosebush near the garden's far wall, wondering whether it still bloomed, whether anyone still cared for it, whether any trace remained of the life she had once imagined for herself in that small Hollowmere garden. In the letter's final pages, the handwriting grew noticeably different, steadier in some places and more fragile in others, and Silas understood, reading the dates she had begun including in the margins, that these last passages had been written many years after the letter's beginning, closer to the end of her own life than to its middle years. She wrote that her own health had begun, in recent seasons, to follow a pattern uncomfortably familiar from her father's final years, and that this slow reckoning with her own mortality had brought her, at last, to a clarity she wished she had found decades earlier. She had spent, she wrote, the better part of her adult life telling herself that there would always be more time, more opportunity to make right what circumstance had left unfinished between them, and only now, facing the narrowing of her own remaining years, did she understand how foolish that quiet postponement had truly been. She wrote, in words that Silas would return to many times in the days and weeks that followed, that she did not know whether this letter would ever actually find him, whether he still lived in Hollowmere at all, whether the years had carried him somewhere else entirely, as they might easily have done for any reasonable man left waiting without explanation. But she wrote that if, by whatever quiet grace governed such things, the letter did eventually reach him, she wanted him to know that she had never once, in all the years of her absence, stopped thinking of him, that the promise she had asked of him at the garden gate had never been simply about the roses themselves, but about leaving some small, living piece of herself behind in the one place she had ever truly felt at peace, and about trusting that if that small piece continued to bloom, it would mean that some part of what had grown quietly between them in that garden had survived, even across all the years and all the silence that circumstance had placed between them. The letter's final lines were the simplest of all, written, Silas suspected, closer to the very end of her life than any of the pages before them, the handwriting careful but visibly weakened. She wrote only that she hoped, wherever he was and whatever life he had made for himself, that he had found some measure of the peace she herself had struggled so long to find, and that if the white rose still bloomed each autumn as it once had, she hoped he might understand it, at last, not as a burden she had left him to carry, but as her own quiet, imperfect way of saying that she had loved him, in the particular unhurried way that grew between two people who tend the same garden long enough to understand each other without needing very many words at all, and that she was sorry, more sorry than the letter could ever properly express, for all the years that silence and circumstance had cost them both. Silas sat for a long while after finishing the letter, the lamp burning low beside him, the small kitchen utterly silent around him save for the faint tick of the clock on the mantel and the softer, steadier sound of his own breathing. A single coal shifted in the small grate nearby, settling with a soft, private sound, and beyond the window the lane had gone fully dark, the last lamplight along Elderbrook Lane long since extinguished for the night. He did not weep, though something in his chest had loosened in a way he had not felt in 20 years, a tightness he had carried for so long that its sudden absence felt almost disorienting, like a weight lifted so gradually that its true size only became apparent once it was finally, fully gone. He found, sitting there in the quiet lamplight, that what he felt was not grief exactly, though grief was certainly part of it, nor was it quite relief, though relief moved through him too gently, like the first mild day after a long, hard winter. What he felt, more than anything else, was a kind of settling, as though some question he had carried unspoken for 2 full decades had finally, gently, been answered, not with the explanation he might once have imagined, full of drama or misunderstanding, but with something far simpler and, in its own quiet way, far more comforting. That he had not been forgotten, that his patient devotion had not been given to an empty promise, and that whatever 20 years of tending a garden for a woman who never returned had cost him, it had not, in the end, been given in vain. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases sometime near midnight, though he did not put it away in any drawer or box, choosing instead to leave it resting on the small table beside his lamp, where he could see it still one final time before finally allowing himself to sleep. And as he lay in the quiet dark of his cottage that night, listening to the faint, familiar sounds of Hollowmere settling into its own gentle rest around him, he found himself thinking, with a tenderness that had nothing left in it of the old sharp ache, of the white rose waiting in the walled garden, and of the small iron key still hanging, as it always had, on its hook beside his door, ready, as it had been every morning for 20 years, to let him in once more at first light. Morning came softly over Hollowmere, the frost that had silvered the grass the day before now retreating slowly beneath a pale autumn sun, and Silas woke earlier than usual, though he could not have said precisely why, only that something in him felt lighter, unburdened in a way sleep alone could not account for. He rose, made his tea, and stood for a long moment at his kitchen window, the small pane of glass still fogged faintly at its edges with the night's cold, the garden beyond it just beginning to show its shapes in the strengthening light, looking out at the small garden he kept for himself, before finally reaching for his coat and, tucked once more into its breast pocket, the letter he had read the night before, though this time he carried it not as a weight he feared, but as something closer to, a keepsake, a companion he no longer wished to leave behind. He walked to the hall as he had every morning for 20 years, though the walk itself felt different that day, the familiar path along Elderbrook Lane and across the green somehow gentler beneath his feet, the greetings he exchanged with the baker's wife and the lamplighter's boy carrying a warmth he had not realized, until that morning, he had been quietly withholding from the village all along. When he reached the garden gate, he paused, as he always did, to fit the small iron key into its lock, and found himself smiling, faintly and without any particular effort, at the familiar resistance of the old mechanism, worn smooth by 2 decades of the same patient hand. The garden welcomed him as it always had, the roses along the far wall catching the early light, the white rosebush near its usual place looking, if anything, more vivid than it had the morning before, though Silas understood well enough that this was likely only the trick of his own changed heart rather than any true alteration in the flower itself. He knelt beside it as he had 1,000 mornings before, his knees finding the same worn patch of earth they always found, softened over 20 years into something almost like a groove in the ground itself, and for a long while simply remained there unmoving, listening to the quiet sounds of the garden waking around him, the soft rustle of wine through the old oak, the distant call of some birds settling into the hedge, and he found himself speaking aloud. For the first time in 20 years, though there was no one there to hear him, a few quiet words of gratitude, not for any single thing in particular, but for the whole slow, patient shape of the life the garden had allowed him, even in the years he had not fully understood the reasons behind it. Tom Wynne found him there a little before mid-morning, and something in Silas's bearing that day must have told him at once that whatever burden the older man had been carrying since their last conversation had, in some essential way, been set down. For he did not ask directly about the letter, only settled himself onto the low garden wall as he had before and waited, with the easy patience of someone who had already learned, in his short time knowing Silas, that the man spoke in his own time and no other. When Silas finally did speak, he told Tom only the smallest part of what the letter had contained, enough to explain, gently, the shape of the misunderstanding that had kept him waiting so faithfully for so long, without ever revealing the fuller, more private tenderness that had passed between himself and Clara across all those quiet years. Tom listened with evident care, and when Silas had finished, he said only that he was glad, truly glad, that the letter had finally found its way to the man it had been written for, however long that journey had taken. It was in the course of that same conversation, as the two men sat together in the mild autumn sun with the garden settling comfortably around them, that Tom raised, with a careful sort of hope, the question of what might become of the Hall now that he had come to understand, more fully than he had on his first visit, just how much history the old house and its garden truly held. He explained that he had spoken, in the days since their last meeting, with builders and surveyors about the practical work of restoring the property, and that walking those rooms morning after morning had a way of settling a person's mind on such matters more surely than any amount of distant deliberation ever could, so that he had begun to think, more seriously than before, that Hollowmere Hall ought not remain empty forever, that his aunt's memory deserved better than another 20 years of shuttered windows and untended rooms. He asked Silas, with a directness that seemed to surprise even himself, whether he might consider staying on properly, not merely as the quiet, unofficial keeper of a garden that belonged to no one, but as its rightful head gardener, paid and welcomed and given, at last, the standing his 2 decades of devotion had long ago earned him in every sense but the formal one. Silas did not answer immediately, though not because he was uncertain of his answer. He sat for a while simply looking around the garden he had tended for so long in such careful silence, at the roses he had shaped with his own patient hands across 20 faithful years, and he found himself thinking, with a gentleness that surprised him, that Clara herself would have wanted nothing more than to see her garden cared for openly, without the quiet secrecy that had shadowed his devotion for so long. When he finally answered Tom, it was with a simplicity that matched everything else about him. A quiet yes, offered without ceremony, though Tom, watching the older man's face as he said it, understood well enough the depth of feeling that single small word actually carried. The weeks that followed brought a gentle, welcome change to Hollowmere Hall, the sort of change the village had not seen in 20 years and had, in its own quiet way, nearly stopped hoping for. Builders arrived to see to the roof and the long-neglected stonework. Ivy was carefully cleared from windows that had not felt sunlight in decades, and slowly, patiently, The great house began to wake from its long sleep, much as the garden behind it had, in its own quiet fashion, never truly slept at all. Silas continued his mornings much as he always had, though now the walk to the garden gate carried none of the old solitary weight it once had. For there were, increasingly, other voices in the halls and other footsteps on its gravel drive, and the village of Hollowmere, watching all of this unfold with the same gentle curiosity it had always shown the hall and its mysteries, found itself, for the first time in a generation, imagining a future for the old house rather than merely mourning its past. Mrs. Atwood took to visiting the garden more often that autumn than she had in all the years before combined, bringing with her, on more than one occasion, a small pot of tea much as Clara herself once had. And though she never said so directly, Silas understood, from the particular warmth of her visits, that she had guessed a good deal more of the letter's true contents than he had ever actually told her, and that she had chosen, out of the same gentle tenderness that had always defined her friendship with him, to let him keep whatever private tenderness remained his alone to hold. She took to bringing, along with the tea, small offerings from the village itself, a jar of preserves from the baker's wife, a bundle of dried lavender from a neighbor 2 doors down Elderbrook Lane, a small twist of honey from the old apiary at the edge of the green, a jar of quince preserves someone's grandmother had put up that autumn, as though Hollowmere itself, sensing that something long unsettled had finally come to rest, wished in its own quiet way to welcome Silas more fully into the ordinary warmth of village life than it had ever quite managed to before. The garden itself seemed to settle into a new kind of rhythm that autumn, one Silas found himself noticing with a fondness he had not expected. He began, for the first time in 20 years, to make small changes to the beds beyond the ones Clara herself had planted, adding here a row of hardy chrysanthemums that would carry color into the very edge of winter, mending there a stretch of low wall that had crumbled slightly with age, and though he was careful never to disturb the white rosebush or the paths immediately around it, he found a quiet satisfaction in shaping the garden forward rather than simply preserving it, as though the promise he had kept for so long had finally room to grow into something more than mere faithfulness, something closer to a living inheritance he might now, with Tom's blessing, tend and expand for whoever came after him. Tom himself visited often that season, staying sometimes for days at a stretch in a small guest room the builders had made habitable early in their work, and though his knowledge of gardens remained modest at best, he took to walking the paths with Silas most mornings, asking questions with the same simple curiosity his aunt had once shown, listening with real attention as Silas explained which beds wanted more sun, which corners stayed too damp through the winter months, which of the old roses had been Clara's particular favorites and why. In this quiet, unhurried way, a friendship began to grow between the two men that neither had expected when Tom first came walking up the weed-softened drive that mild autumn afternoon. A friendship built not on shared history, for they had none, but on the shared tending of a place that had come to matter deeply to them both, for reasons that were, in their own ways, entirely different and yet not so very far apart, born in small, unremarkable exchanges over cups of tea gone cold on the garden wall, in shared silences that needed no filling, in the easy, patient rhythm of two men who had each, in their own way, come to this garden carrying something they did not yet fully understand. They took, in time, to sharing a pot of tea most mornings, often on the very bench near the far wall that Silas had once pointed out as Clara's favorite. A small detail neither man ever commented on but both, in their own quiet way, seemed to appreciate, before Tom returned to whatever business the restoration required of him that day, the two of them sitting together in a companionable quiet that needed no particular conversation to sustain it, the kind of ease that usually takes families years to build, arrived at here in the space of a single changing season. As October gave way to November, the village settled into the particular hush that autumn always brought to Hollowmere, the trees along the green shedding their last leaves in slow, unhurried drifts, the mornings arriving colder and dimmer, the evenings drawing in earlier with each passing week. The bakery began selling its heavier winter loaves, dense with seed and dried fruit, and the innkeeper hung a wreath of dried herbs above his door, as he did every year at this same turning of the season. The orchard beyond the village gave up its last apples that same week, the air thick with the sweet, faintly fermented smell of windfall fruit, and children could be heard some afternoons laughing along its rows, gathering what they could carry home in the folds of their aprons before the frost claimed what remained. Silas felt the cold more than he once had, his years settling more heavily into his knees and his shoulders than they used to, though he found, that particular November, that he minded the ache less than he might have in years past, as though some deeper weariness had finally lifted, leaving only the ordinary, honest tiredness of a body that had simply lived a long, full life of careful work. He took to walking home a little more slowly in the evenings that month, pausing more often than he once had along Elderbrook Lane to exchange a few words with neighbors he had, in truth, known his whole life but rarely paused to speak with at any length. He found himself, on more than one such evening, invited in for a cup of tea by the roadside, or asked to stay for supper by a family who had watched him pass their window for decades and had simply, quietly, decided that the season of his solitary walking might finally be drawing to some gentler close. Silas accepted these invitations more often than he once would have, finding in them a warmth he had not realized, until that autumn, how much he had been missing, and Hollowmere, in its own patient way, seemed glad to finally have him among them more fully than it ever had before. Mrs. Atwood, watching all of this unfold from behind her post-office window as she had watched so much of Hollowmere's small history unfold before her over the years, found herself thinking often, that autumn, of Clara Wynne, and of the particular grace by which some things, left long enough in patient, faithful hands, eventually found their way to a kind of resolution no one could have predicted or hurried along. She never asked Silas directly what more the letter had contained beyond what he had already told her, understanding, with the same tenderness that had always shaped her friendship with him, that some things were meant to remain entirely his own, held close and private, the way a person holds the last warm ember of a fire they do not wish to let go out entirely, even once its purpose has, in every practical sense, been fulfilled. The first true snow came to Hollowmere in the second week of December, settling soft and silent over the village rooftops overnight, muffling every ordinary sound the village usually carried, so that even the church bell, when it rang the hour that morning, seemed to reach him more softly than usual, as though the snow itself had asked the whole world to speak a little more gently. Silas woke that morning to a world gone entirely white and hushed, the kind of morning that seemed to ask nothing of anyone beyond simple stillness and quiet gratitude. He made his way to the hall as he always did, his footprints the first to mark the fresh snow along the drive, and found the garden transformed into something quieter and more solemn than its autumn self, the rose beds sleeping now beneath a soft white covering, the old oak's bare branches traced delicately in white against a pale morning sky. His own breath hung visible in the still air as he worked, and the only sound beyond his own movements was the occasional soft collapse of snow sliding from an overladen branch somewhere near the garden wall, landing with a small, muffled thud that seemed, in the deep hush of that particular morning, almost as loud as a church bell. He knelt, as he always did, beside the white rosebush and found, to no great surprise, that even beneath the season's first snowfall, a single small bud remained, tightly furled but undeniably present, as though the bush had simply decided, in its own quiet stubbornness, that this particular winter would be no different from any of the 20 that came before it. He worked slowly that morning, clearing snow gently from the more delicate beds. His gloves soon soaked through despite their thickness, his fingers stiff with cold in a way that would once have driven him quickly back toward the warmth of his own hearth, though that morning he found himself in no particular hurry to leave, checking that the mulch he had laid weeks before still held its careful protection against the coming cold, and found himself, as he often did now in these quiet solitary hours, speaking softly to the garden as he worked, small unremarkable observations about the weather or the state of the soil, the kind of quiet talk that once might have felt strange to him, offered as it was to no one who could answer, but which now felt only natural, an easy continuation of 20 years spent listening for whatever the garden itself seemed to be quietly saying back. Tom arrived at the Hall 2 days before Christmas that year, bringing with him a small gathering of distant relatives who had never before set foot in Hollowmere, curious at last, now that the house was being restored, to see the place their aunt had so rarely spoken of in all her later years. The hall, though still far from fully finished, had been made warm and welcoming enough by then to host a modest gathering, and Silas found himself invited, somewhat to his own surprise, to join the small family for supper on Christmas Eve, an invitation he accepted with a quiet gratitude that surprised even him, for he had spent so many holiday seasons alone in his small cottage on Elderbrook Lane that the prospect of company, warm and unhurried, felt like its own small, unexpected gift. The hall's great dining room, still bare of most of its old furnishings, had been warmed that evening with nothing more than a long trestle table, borrowed chairs, and candlelight enough to soften every rough, unfinished corner into something that felt, despite its incompleteness, entirely like home. The evening proved a gentle one, the long table lit by candles set in mismatched holders gathered from every corner of the half-restored house, their light catching warm along the old wood paneling that had, until that season, stood dark and unseen for 20 years, full of the easy, meandering conversation that gatherings of near strangers sometimes fall into when there is no particular urgency to the occasion beyond simple warmth and company. The relatives, curious about the house and its history, asked Silas a great many questions about the garden and about Clara herself, and he found, to his own quiet relief, that he could speak of her now with a settled tenderness rather than the old guarded ache, telling small stories of her laughter, her particular fondness for the white rose, her habit of walking the garden paths each evening just as the light began to soften, without ever once needing to explain the fuller private history that remained, as it always would now, entirely his own. After supper, as the small gathering settled into quieter conversation before the fire that had been lit, for the first time in 20 years, in the hall's grand old hearth, Silas excused himself for a few moments and made his way out into the garden alone, drawn there as he so often was by some quiet instinct he had long since stopped questioning. The snow had begun again, falling soft and steady in the dark, catching what little light spilled from the hall's newly lit windows, and Silas stood for a long while simply watching it settle over the sleeping beds, over the low stone walls, over the white rosebush near the garden's far corner, its single tight bud now dusted lightly with fresh snow. He thought, standing there in the hushed, snow-quiet dark, of how very different this Christmas felt from all the 20 that had come before it, not because anything essential about the garden or his devotion to it had changed, but because the long solitary waiting that had once shaped every one of those holiday seasons had finally, gently, given way to something closer to peace. He was no longer waiting, he understood, standing there in the softly falling snow, for anything at all. Clara's story had reached its quiet, settled ending, and his own had, in its own patient way, found its resolution alongside hers, not through any dramatic reunion, but through the simple, sufficient grace of finally understanding what all those years of quiet tending had actually meant. He returned to the warmth of the hall a short while later, snow still clinging lightly to his coat, and rejoined the small gathering by the fire, accepting, when it was offered, a cup of mulled cider from Tom, who asked, with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the preceding months, whether the roses were holding up well against the cold. Silas answered that they were, as they always did, and something in the simple ordinariness of the exchange, a gardener reassuring a friend about the state of his beds, settled over him with a warmth that had nothing at all to do with the fire beside them. Winter deepened over Hollowmere in the weeks that followed, the days growing shorter still before beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen once more toward the distant promise of spring. Silas continued his mornings much as he always had, though the hall around him grew steadily warmer and more lived in with each passing week, workmen giving way gradually to the quieter presence of a household slowly finding its shape again after 2 decades of silence. Tom spoke, as the new year approached, of dividing his time between the city and Hollowmere, of perhaps one day making the hall his primary home, though he was careful never to rush such decisions, understanding, perhaps better than he could have explained, that some things in Hollowmere had always moved at their own unhurried pace, and were better left to do so. Mrs. Atwood remained a steady, gentle presence throughout that winter, trudging up the drive some mornings through snow deep enough to soak the hem of her coat, never once complaining of the cold or the distance, continuing her visits to the garden even in the coldest weeks, when little grew and there was less, in any practical sense, for Silas to actually tend. She came anyway, bringing tea and small village news, content simply to sit with him for a while in the quiet cold, and on more than one such visit, she found herself thinking that the garden itself seemed to hold a different quality of stillness now than it once had. Not the heavy, waiting silence of all those earlier years, but something lighter, more settled, the particular piece of a story that has finally been allowed to reach its proper end. As the last week of that particular winter drew toward its close, and the first faint hints of a coming thaw began to soften the hardest edges of the frost, Silas found himself once more, on a quiet evening much like the one on which this story began, kneeling beside the white rosebush near the garden's far wall. The last light of the day was settling gold and soft across the old stone walls around him, much as it had on that very first morning, though the season had turned nearly full circle since then, and the man kneeling in the fading light was, in some essential way he could not have fully explained, a different man than the one who had knelt there so many months before. He reached out, as he always did, and touched one petal of the small bud that had held through the whole of that long winter, still tightly furled but undeniably alive, waiting, as it always had, for the proper season to finally open. He thought, kneeling there, of all the mornings that had brought him to this same small patch of earth across 20 patient years, of the promise he had made at that very gate to a young woman he had never stopped loving, and of the strange, gentle grace by which that promise had finally, after so long, been allowed to come full circle. He understood now, in a way he had not fully understood even in the earliest days after reading her letter, that Clara had been right in its final lines, that the white rose had never truly been a burden he was asked to carry, but a quiet, living way of saying what neither of them had ever quite found the words to say aloud in all their years together in that garden, and that some promises were never meant to be finished so much as simply, faithfully, kept. He rose slowly, his knees stiff from the cold and the kneeling, and made his way toward the garden gate as the last light finally faded fully from the sky above Hollowmere. Behind him, the hall's windows glowed warm against the deepening dusk, voices and quiet laughter drifting faintly from within, the sound of a house no longer empty, no longer waiting. He locked the gate behind him with the same small iron key Clara had pressed into his hand 2 decades before, the metal cool and familiar beneath his fingers, and turned to make his way home along Elderbrook Lane, the first soft rain of the coming thaw beginning to fall, gentle and unhurried, across the sleeping village. He walked slowly, in no particular hurry, past the bakery's darkened windows and the inn's low glowing lamps, past the post office where Mrs. Atwood's own light still burned faintly behind drawn curtains, past the quiet cottages of Elderbrook Lane where his neighbors were settling, one by one, into their own evening rest. The rain fell softly around him the whole way home, the kind of rain that seemed to settle rather than disturb, gathering in small quiet pools along the cobblestones, whispering gently against the old slate roofs. The whole village softened by it into something gentler and more forgiving than even its ordinary daylight self. Every hard edge of stone and slate blurred faintly by the falling gray, and Silas found, walking through it, that he minded the cold and the wet not at all, that some deeper warmth had settled into him that no weather could quite reach. Spring came to Hollowmere slowly that year, as it always did, arriving not in any single dramatic thaw but in a gradual softening of the world, day by patient day, the birds outside his window growing noticeably louder and more insistent with each passing morning than they had been through the whole hushed length of winter, as though they sensed, before he did, that something in the season was about to shift, until one morning Silas woke to find that the frost had not, in fact, returned to silver the grass overnight, and understood, before he had even risen from his bed, that the season had finally, quietly turned. He dressed in the pale early light and made his way to the hall as he always did, though the walk itself felt different now, the hedgerows along Elderbrook Lane beginning to show the faintest green at their edges, the birdsong thicker and more insistent than it had been through all the long, hushed months of winter. He found the garden transformed when he reached it, not all at once, for gardens rarely change all at once, but in the 100 small ways that spring always announced itself to those patient enough to notice, the first snowdrops pushing up pale and brave along the northern wall, the crocuses opening their careful cups of purple and gold beneath the old oak, the earliest violets scattered low and unassuming along the base of the garden wall, easy to miss unless a person thought, as Silas always did, to look for them, the soil itself smelling different somehow, richer and more alive than it had through the long sleep of winter. Silas moved slowly through the beds that morning, checking each one with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had done this same careful accounting every spring for 20 years, noting which perennials had survived the cold, which needed dividing, which corners wanted a little more sun coaxed into them before the fuller warmth of the coming months arrived. He came, at last, to the white rosebush near the garden's far wall, and knelt beside it as he always did, and found, with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing left in it of the old uncertain waiting, that the single tight bud which had held through the whole of that long winter had finally, in the space of what felt like a single warm night, begun to loosen its careful grip, the outermost petals just beginning to part, pale and faintly luminous even in the soft gray light of early morning. He touched it gently, as he always did, and thought, kneeling there, of how many springs he had watched this same small miracle unfold, 20 of them now, each one arriving with its own particular grace, though none, he found himself thinking, had ever felt quite so unburdened as this one. Tom arrived at the hall not long after, having taken, over the winter months, to spending more and more of his time in Hollowmere, until by that first week of true spring, he had begun speaking openly of making the place his permanent home rather than an occasional retreat from the city. He found Silas in his usual place beside the rosebush and settled himself, as had become his habit, onto the low garden wall nearby, watching the older man work with the same quiet appreciation he had shown from the very first days of their friendship. He mentioned, that particular morning, that he had been giving thought to opening the garden itself to the village on certain afternoons, once the weather turned fully warm, an idea he broached carefully, watching Silas's face for any sign of reluctance, for he understood well enough by then how much the garden's long private solitude had come to mean to the man who had tended it so faithfully. Silas considered the suggestion for a long moment, his hands still resting in the cool spring soil, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that the idea did not trouble him in the way he might once have expected. He thought of all the years the garden had kept its beauty hidden behind low stone walls, glimpsed only in passing by market-day travelers who paused briefly at the wall before continuing on their way, and he thought that Clara herself, who had always taken such simple joy in sharing the garden's small wonders with anyone patient enough to notice them, would have wanted nothing more than to see it finally opened to the wider warmth of the village she had loved, even if circumstance had kept her from it for so much of her own life. He told Tom after a while that he thought it a fine idea, and Tom, hearing the genuine warmth in the older man's voice, smiled in the easy, unguarded way that had become familiar between them over the preceding months. The garden opened to the village for the first time on a mild afternoon in late April, the gates thrown wide for what Tom had modestly called simply an open afternoon, though half of Hollowmere seemed to find its way up the long drive before the day was through, drawn by curiosity that 2 decades of closed gates had only deepened rather than dampened. Children ran ahead of their parents along the newly opened paths, delighting in beds of tulips taller than they were used to seeing, while their elders lingered more slowly near the roses, exchanging quiet remarks about how very like old times it felt to walk those paths again, if with a fondness sharpened rather than dulled by all the years the garden had spent unseen. Silas found himself, that afternoon, in the unfamiliar position of guide rather than solitary keeper, walking small groups of neighbors through the beds he had tended so long in silence, answering their questions about which roses bloomed earliest and which paths had been Clara Wynn's particular favorites, pointing out, when asked, the particular bench near the far wall where she had liked best to sit of an evening, and the low stretch of border where she had once grown herbs for the kitchen, rather than flowers for pleasure alone, and he discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not mind the company nearly so much as he might once have expected, that there was a quiet pleasure in finally sharing what he had kept so carefully to himself for so many patient years. Mrs. Atwood came that afternoon too, bringing with her a small group of the village's oldest residents, several of whom remembered the hall from the years before its closing and walked its paths with the particular tenderness of people revisiting a piece of their own younger lives. She found Silas near the white rosebush toward the end of the afternoon, the crowds having thinned as the light began to soften toward evening, and stood beside him a while in comfortable silence, watching the last of the village visitors make their way slowly back down the drive. She told him, after a while, that she thought this was exactly as it should be, the garden finally open and shared rather than kept in solitary secret, and that she believed, though she could not of course know for certain, that Clara would have felt the same, would have wanted her garden to become, in time, something the whole village could love rather than a private grief carried alone by one faithful man. Silas nodded slowly at this, understanding the truth of it even as something in his chest still held, gently and without any real sorrow now, the particular private tenderness of all those solitary years, a tenderness he understood he would carry, in some quiet corner of himself, for however many years remained to him, even as the garden itself moved forward into this new, more open chapter of its long life. The weeks that followed brought the garden into its fullest spring glory, bed after bed coming into bloom in the careful sequence Silas had shaped across 2 decades of patient attention. The early crocuses giving way to daffodils, the daffodils to tulips, until by the middle of May the whole walled space seemed to hum with color and scent and the low steady drone of bees moving unhurried between the blossoms. Butterflies drifted lazily between the taller blooms on the warmest afternoons, and more than once Silas paused his work simply to watch them, struck by how completely the garden had filled back out into the kind of abundance he remembered from his very first years there, before the long solitary decades had ever begun. The white rosebush, true to its nature, bloomed last among the roses, as it always had, though when it finally opened fully in the last week of May, it did so more abundantly than Silas could remember in many years, a full flush of pale blossoms covering the old bush from base to crown, as though the plant itself understood, in whatever quiet way plants understand such things, that this particular spring called for something more than its usual modest offering. Tom, seeing it in full bloom for the first time, asked Silas whether it had always flowered so generously, and Silas told him, with the particular quiet honesty that had come to define their friendship, that he did not believe it had, that in all his years of tending it he could not recall a spring when the bush had given quite so much of itself all at once. He did not offer any further explanation, for he did not entirely have one himself, only a private sense, which he kept to himself that afternoon, that the garden, in its own patient and unhurried way, understood a great deal more about the long story it had witnessed than anyone walking its paths could ever fully articulate. It was in the first week of June, almost exactly a year after Tom had first come walking up the weed-softened drive with his aunt's letter tucked carefully in his satchel, that Silas found himself on a warm and gentle evening, kneeling once more beside the white rosebush at the very same hour he had knelt there on the morning this story began. The garden around him had changed a great deal in the year between, the beds fuller and more varied than they had been, the low stone walls mended where age had worn them thin, the hall behind him glowing warm and welcoming in the early evening light rather than standing dark and shuttered as it once had. And yet the rosebush itself, and the man kneeling beside it, remained, in their essential natures, exactly as they had always been, faithful and unhurried, shaped by the same patient devotion that had carried them both through 20 years of quiet waiting and, at last, into this fuller season of understanding. He thought, kneeling there in the soft evening light, of everything the past year had brought him, the letter he had finally found the courage to read, the truth of Clara's long, quiet exile that had turned out to be born not of indifference but of love, the friendship that had grown, unexpectedly and gently, between himself and her nephew, the wider warmth of a village that had finally been given the chance to share in a garden it had watched with curious affection for so many years from beyond its low stone walls. He thought, too, with a tenderness that had settled by then into something closer to gratitude than grief, of Clara herself, of the particular grace by which her own long silence had finally been allowed to speak, even if it had taken the whole of her own remaining years to find the courage to write the words down, and the whole of his own patient waiting to finally understand them. Mrs. Atwood found him there as the light began to soften further toward dusk, the garden settling into that particular hush that comes just before true dark, when the last birds fall silent and the first bats begin their low, quick circuits above the hedges, arriving as she often did now in these gentle evening hours, though this time she brought with her not tea but a small cutting from the white rosebush itself, taken carefully some weeks before and rooted patiently in a small pot on her own windowsill, a gift she said she had been saving for precisely this evening, though she could not entirely explain, even to herself, why this particular date had seemed to matter so much. She set the small pot down beside him on the garden wall, her own hands weathered now with age but still careful and sure, and told him only that she thought it was time the rose began to spread a little further than its single corner of Hollowmere Hall, that some things, once they had finally been allowed to bloom fully, deserved the chance to take root in more places than one. Silas looked at the small rooted cutting for a long moment, and then at Mrs. Atwood, and felt something move through him that he did not immediately have words for, though he understood, in some quiet way, that it was simply the particular fullness of a heart that has, after many long years of careful waiting, finally been allowed to rest. He thanked her, simply and without excess, in the way he thanked everyone for everything, and told her that he thought he knew exactly where such a cutting ought to be planted, a small sunny corner near his own cottage on Elderbrook Lane, where he might tend it each morning before making his way to the hall, a second small piece of Clara's garden carried forward into the ordinary rhythm of his own daily life. He planted the cutting the following morning, kneeling in the modest garden behind his own blue door as the village woke gently around him. The morning still cool enough to hold the last trace of dew along every leaf. The air thick with the smell of turned soil and the first mown grass of the season drifting faintly from some neighboring garden. The same careful hands that had shaped Hollowmere Hall's grand garden for 20 years now turning the smaller, humbler soil of his own modest plot, with no less tenderness or attention. He thought, working there in the early light, that this was perhaps the truest ending the whole long story could have been given. Not a single garden tended in solitary secret, but two gardens now, one grand and one humble, both carrying forward the same small stubborn miracle of a rose that had refused, across 20 patient years, to let a promise go unkept. The summer that followed unfolded in Hollowmere with the same gentle, unhurried rhythm the village had always known, the days lengthening toward their fullest warmth, the market stalls filling with the season's first fruit, baskets of early strawberries and the first tender peas drawing customers from as far as the neighboring parish, the evenings drawing out long and golden over the green. Swallows returned to nest beneath the eaves of the old inn, as they did every year, and the bees from the apiary at the edge of the green grew busy and loud among the lavender that had begun, at last, to spread along the garden's southern wall. Silas continued his mornings at the hall much as he always had, though his afternoons now more often included time in his own small garden, tending the young rose cutting alongside his vegetables and his modest row of herbs, watching it settle slowly into its new home with the same patient care he had once given its parent plant so many years before. Tom settled fully into Hollowmere Hall by the end of that summer, dividing his time less and less with the city until the old house had become, in every meaningful sense, his true home rather than a distant inheritance he visited out of dutiful curiosity. He and Silas continued their easy friendship, walking the garden paths together most mornings, and it became, in time, a settled and comfortable habit between them, one that neither man commented on directly but that both understood, in their own quiet ways, had become one of the steadiest pleasures of their respective lives. Mrs. Atwood remained, as she always had, the gentle keeper of Hollowmere's small truths, watching over the village and its people with the same patient tenderness she had shown for so many decades, and she took particular quiet pride, in the years that followed, in having been the one to carry the white roses first cutting beyond the walls of the hall's garden, understanding, in her own wise way, that some stories deserved to spread a little further than their original telling, deserved to take root in more hearts than the one that had carried them so faithfully alone for so very long. As for the garden itself, it continued its slow, patient unfolding through every season that followed, the white rosebush blooming each autumn as it always had, though now it did so within a garden that welcomed visitors, and a village that had come to understand, at last, the quiet story its blossoms had been faithfully telling all along. And Silas Thorne continued to kneel beside it each morning, through frost and rain and the season's first soft snowfall, though the kneeling itself had long since ceased to be an act of solitary waiting, and had become instead, simply and completely, an act of quiet, contented love, offered freely to a garden, and a memory, and a promise finally fully understood. He reached his own small cottage a little before 9, the blue door swinging open beneath his familiar hand, the kettle waiting cold and quiet on its stand exactly where he had left it that morning. He did not light the lamp right away, choosing instead to stand for a long moment in his own dark doorway, listening to the rain settle over the roof above him and the whole sleeping village beyond it, and he found himself thinking, with a tenderness that had nothing left in it of the old sharp ache, of the white rose waiting in the walled garden, and of the small iron key still warm in his coat pocket, ready, as it had been every morning for 20 years, to let him in once more at first light. And somewhere behind that low garden wall, beneath the darkening sky, the white rose remained exactly where it always had, its small tight bud holding patiently through the last cold nights of winter, faithful and unhurried, waiting, as it always would now, not in sorrow, but in the simple, settled peace of a promise finally, fully understood, ready to open again as it always did, when its own proper season finally came. Thank you for listening. Rest well.